Okay, I hope you are enjoying the speeches as much as I am, or more, that's fine too. I'm pleased to present the workshop. This is going to be a 45-minute session, and it's exciting to have Jay here. Jay has a degree in film and video production and fine art and photography from the University of Miami in Florida. He is founder of the new media startup Cineflock, LLC, and he focuses not only on the proliferation of gigapixel-resolution imagery to the public, but also on the appreciation and general widespread acceptance of cutting-edge digital technologies as tools for artistic and creative development. His gigapans have received widespread recognition, garnering awards at national juried photography competitions, as well as being profiled in the press. And the talk is named More Than Meets the Eye, Gigapixel Resolution, High Dynamic Range Imaging Workflow and Techniques. Thank you for coming, Jay.
Thank you. Cool. Hey guys. Cool. So I'm going to start with like an introduction to myself and how I got involved in this sort of stuff, just to, because it's a ridiculous story. I'll put it out there. But so basically in February 2009, I saw, of course, the Obama picture that we're all very, I think, familiar with. And I was really, really interested in the technique just because I've always wanted to make really big pictures, really big prints like we all do. And so I kind of looked at this and I said, okay, there's no artist, there's no like fine art photographer who's using this as a medium for art, for fine art. So I wanted to be the first fine artist who was working at a gigapixel resolution scale on that sort of a medium. So it initially became a question of how do I set myself apart? So I started looking through the gigapan.org website and going through all this sort of stuff, and I realized no one's done HDR, and I didn't know if it was like because the technical capabilities weren't there. Can you hear me? Good. Cool. Because the technical capabilities weren't there, or if it just wasn't needed yet, or something like that. And the more that I'm hearing, I think it is kind of like a problem that needs to be addressed because a lot of people have like lighting issues, and they kind of want like the even exposure across that sort of spherical plane of view. So I started developing a technique for that, which I'm going to share with you on sort of how to batch process your HDR images and then stitch the final thing. And it's not very like high technological sort of stuff. It's pretty cut and dry, and it should give you like a very good tool that you can use in your gigapans tomorrow if you purchase the software, of course. But so after that, it kind of became a question of what subject matter do I approach as a fine artist. And I shot skylines and landscapes, like we all probably have. And then I remember this abandoned structure in northeast New Jersey that was stunning to me, and always kind of captivated my interest. And it was a perfect kind of test bed for the HDR processes because of the area that it's in. You can see this is a 360-degree view, and it's got incredibly dark corners as well as these bright openings because it's such a decrepit spot. And a lot of the places that graffiti is drawn up and thrown up in is like this. It's very decrepit. There's no interior lighting. I mean, the shadows are terrible. So it was kind of like the perfect idea to shoot this stuff. And once I saw the finished product, it was clear. It was kind of the opposite approach. I kind of fell in love with my subject matter, and I just started going around and discovering as much as I could. And that was really where this stuff kind of intersects with the gigapan technology on a whole in terms of exploration and even further. I think there's huge parallels here with like cave art. I mean, there's so much stuff that's being said about cave art. The first thing when you talk to any of these graffiti artists is, I mean, because people will be like, oh, you're committing vandalism and all that, and they'll kind of support their argument by saying, well, people have been drawing on walls for thousands of years. So I think it has some really interesting parallels that are pretty much there and pretty modern now. But so yeah, so I started falling in love with the subject matter. And as part of this, and this is, I'll go into this as my lightning talk, but I ended up putting this stuff on the clothing as well, which you can kind of see here. Kind of an interesting segue. And this also plays into the gigapan stuff because of the flexible design and all that. But I'm here to talk about HDR, so let's get into it. Okay, basically, do you guys have exposure bracketing on your camera? Is anyone familiar with exposure bracketing? If you do, it's kind of something like you have to read your manual for your specific camera to figure out, and it does take some experimentation and all that. But basically the way that I shoot my photographs is I set the camera to auto bracket, which for a D90 is 3 exposures, and you can go to +2, 0, and -2 exposure values in any way. And when I started doing this, I used the Gigapan Epic And I tried doing the multiple shutter release thing, and it just wasn't really like there, and it took too much time because each shutter release needed to be a specific amount of seconds, and you don't need that much time for the underexposure in many cases. It's a third, of the stop or a third of the time that you need to expose the image. So it just wasn't convenient. So with the Epic 100, I specifically kind of just did a long shutter release, and it would capture just the 3 images there and at each position, and then I would have 3 times the image data, of course, but I could just process it very quickly. With the Epic Pro, I would suggest doing the shutter release method because it's just such a fast device and it's very, very convenient to do that as well. But so once you have these images, you can bring them into a program that I use called Photomatix, and I was just told this is the only HDR program that supports batch processing, so this is probably what you want to use, even though you can use Photoshop and you can use a lot of other programs, Google HDR processing if you want to explore all the packages that are out there. They all offer some different things. This is actually Photomatix Pro 3 as well. Photomatix Pro 4 just was released a little while ago, and it's unbelievable. It makes this really, really much easier than the technical stuff. This has sliders that has like, here's saturation, here's realistic look, and it's really, really easy at this point. But so for this, what I do is I basically generate an HDR image by taking 3 of my source images, and I'll show you what the source folder that you'll come out of this looking like. You'll see it's 3 images per shot here. You can see that on the screen. Where you always have this zero exposure, this underexposure, and then this overexposure of the same spot. So you can take any one of these images, and I usually start with something that's very high contrast to get a very good sense of where the exposure should be set. In this case, I'm going to use something from the Chrome Penitentiary shot, which has, you can kind of see it here a little bit, even though it's a little bit small. It's an extremely dark corner right next to a really, really bright opening, a really bright door. So it's kind of the best place to test out the HDR stuff. And it'll do, its magic sauce here. And in no time, you'll have an HDR image. And this doesn't look very promising at first. Don't get discouraged. If you click the tone mapping button in Photomatix, you can actually go in here. And here we have something that's extremely colorful, and you can actually get the exposure across it. This is actually an image that probably could have used an additional stop or 2 on either end. You can get that a couple different ways, just by retaking the panorama and going up a couple stops. And there's even charts on the internet that show you exactly how to get to set your camera with exposure bracketing. If you've only got a burst of 3 images, you can go through 9 to 27 different stops if you want per image. I haven't really had that need yet, but. Anyways, these are sort of the different sliders that you can choose here, and this is all kind of experimentation based on what your needs are. But so you can set the white point to decrease or increase contrast. You can set the black point, which will basically do much of the same, and increase the gamma here. There's tons of ways to play around. But at this point, oh, that's not bad. And this is actually, you can. For those of you who shoot rocks and want a more realistic sort of look for it and are just doing it for the exposure, you can actually tone down the color saturation drastically so that those bright colors aren't so bright. But for this setting, here's the important part. Here's where you start batch processing. Is as soon as you get your settings, you can save your settings as a preset in Photomatix. So I've already got one saved, but I'll save it for the heck of it. And here you go to automate, batch processing, and this is where it's the extra gigapixel step, where you basically select your settings here. You can either average the exposure, you can do highlights and shadows, and actually Photomatix 4 has an exposure fusion setting as well, which is interesting to play with. But so when you go to the settings for Generate HDR, you can force the exposure values, which is actually kind of important if the EXIF data isn't already on the camera. So this will actually be able to tell, you can say they were all 2 steps apart, all 3 steps apart. This is all good stuff as well. The attempt to reduce ghosting artifacts, that's a major drawback of this method is if you're shooting moving subjects, as we all kind of already know, gigapixel photography is not really conducive to shooting moving subjects unless you like the ghosted look. HDR is even worse. So it kind of throws all of the moving stuff out the window. But here you can set that up, and if you go up, hang on, where is that? Well, there's a way to set your setting here. Oh, that's what it is. Here you go, process with details enhancers. which is the setting that we were using for the tone mapping. And here you can set the preset to exactly what we set it with before. So I'll set it to Chrome here. And then you go into your folder that you took the original images in. And this is where Photomatix comes in really handy because it automatically knows to take however many images you bracketed. So you can select 3 images at a time, whereas Photoshop, if you set up an action, you could probably do something in the same boat, but it wouldn't be as streamlined. So at this point, you just browse to the folder that you stored the images in. I'm not going to process all of them, don't worry. And then you basically hit run. And you can do a lot of different stuff here, align source images. When I mean, one of the drawbacks with the Epic Pro 100 was that, or the Epic 100, sorry, was that when the shutter pressed, a lot of times the first exposure would be a little bit like lower or higher than the second 2 exposures. So it automatically aligns the source images for you as long as like they're not too off. And it can do that in 2 different ways, by correcting shifts, by matching features. And once you've got everything here that you want, you can just hit run. And yeah, and you can create the destination, play around with the settings, and do it exactly as you need to. And at that point, you just process in Stitcher, and you'll have your own tone-mapped HDR gigapixel panorama. So I think that's actually the bulk of the workshop. Yeah, I think that's good. Any questions? Yeah.
Please interact.
What's the upper limit on the file size you can work with?
In terms of what? In terms of Photomatix?
Yeah.
I'm not sure there is a limitation. I mean, I experimented with a lot of different HDR techniques, including AutoPano. When I started doing this like a year and a half ago, AutoPano's like HDR stuff I think was still kind of in the inception phases. It's since gotten really, really good. So you can actually go into AutoPano, load in all of your source exposures, and then create an HDR gigapixel panorama right there. So I should preface all of this with saying that there are a lot of other HDR ways to go about this. This is just one technique that I think is very quick and very, relatively easy. But in terms of stitching this stuff together, if you're asking like, if you should stitch a panorama first and then throw it into Photomatix, the issue with that is that when you have different exposure ranges across these panoramas, the stitchers will actually find different points to stitch them together at. So you actually end up with different different resolutions for what are essentially the same panoramas. So when you try to line them up, they don't match. So that's why you have to do the batch processing before you do the stitching in a lot of cases, except for AutoPano maybe.
What approximately does this software cost, and is it available for the Macintosh as well as Windows machine?
Yeah, I think it's available for both, and I'm pretty sure it runs like $100. I haven't checked on the pricing for Photomatix 4, but it's not expensive software, relative. I mean, especially to Adobe Photoshop. So I mean, it's pretty reasonable.
When you're creating batch filing, is it putting it, saving your original images and creating Photoshop document for each image, or is it still separated, or is it flattening?
Yeah, this, well, that's actually a really good question. The destination here, you can tell it exactly what to output to. So here you've got a couple different choices. You can do JPEGs and TIFFs. For the sake of time, I usually do JPEGs. But you can also save the HDR image as what's called a Radiance RGBE, which I think is a 32-bit image, which you can specifically tone map to your liking afterwards. And you could go in with the Radiance RGB and basically do anything you wanted to manually at that point to every image. So, and it'll save both of them as well. So you'll get the JPEGs and the Radiance RGB, unless you check this box here, which will just remove that HDR image and give you the JPEGs. Any other questions?
Will you show a few more of your images?
Sure, love to. Yeah. Yeah, and actually, I would love to even shoot more of them. The issue with this sort of stuff is, for instance, this location, which is called Chrome Penitentiary, is like an ex-army base, I think, as legend goes, that was shut down in the 1970s or 80s. And since I've gone there, the police actually raided it because it's used by like paintballers, and of course it's vandalized all the time and stuff. So it's more an issue of finding these locations and getting in there. And actually, here's another one that I took. This is the the bottom, basically, of the Miami Marine Stadium. And this is interesting for some architectural effects, too. If you guys are familiar with the Miami Marine Stadium, it was shut down in 1989. And they were actually, it was condemned, and they were going to tear it down. And it withheld itself up pretty well to like Hurricane Andrew in 1992 and all that, and it's been standing ever since. So I think there's actually going to be a rehab project there, which again is another problem with almost finding these spots, is that they're gone as soon as they appear, which is actually another good reason that I started doing the gigapan stuff with it, because this spot doesn't look like this anymore at all. I mean, it still exists, it's not rehabbed yet, but there's been so much paint that goes over it in the last, I mean, it could be up for a day, it could be up for years, but it's a guarantee that these images do not look like this anymore. So actually, I've been networking with graffiti artists recently, and I was networking with them actually to get their stuff on clothing, because I wanted to make it like kind of this community sort of art project and stuff like that. And as soon as they saw the images, they were blown away. They were like, "Wait, we need this technology! Like they had no way to capture their stuff except taking little point and shoot shots." So this is actually a very, very good format for them as well. And this is a crazy story. This is a 5 gigapixel HDR. I think it's the biggest one in existence. Correct me if I'm wrong. But this is actually an RC Cola factory that was shut down. It's 160,000 square feet. It was just, again, one of these stories where it was just bought by a developer in February. So you can see this looked completely different the first time that I went there. These windows that are all kind of cemented up and stuff like that, were actually open windows, and the entire upstairs was also graffitied. So the original shot, if I could have taken it at the time, would have been even more kind of staggering with graffiti all over the place. And you can see the scaffolding is still there, and they're trying very much to kind of like rehab this again too. But the inside of this, and this is actually where an extended dynamic range in my case would have been a little bit better. I should have taken a little bit more overexposures. But you can start to see the detail on the inside. And the entire inside is covered with anywhere between like 100 to 150 distinct tags. And these graffiti images, these guys spend probably 5 hours or so painting, what are images like that range, 12 feet tall and 8 feet wide. And so like when you're just walking through here, it's one of these kind of visceral experiences where you don't even remember when you've left what you've seen, because it's just too much information to take in. So it's pretty cool stuff. And actually, these are all people that I've met now. Before I took this image, I didn't really like know any of these guys, but I've since this MSG cartel. They're a group of about 30 to 40 artists, and I'm working with them on a line. And this guy Typo actually is in a couple art galleries in Miami, and he's also a fine artist. A lot of these people are fine artists, and sell their stuff for pretty good money out there. But so I've actually met a bunch of these guys, and it's been an interesting experience. I mean, if you want to talk about like exploring, yeah, to look at this and like see my friends now is pretty amazing.
Speaking of money, can you talk about the T-shirt? Is there a revenue model where they want to get revenue back from the T-shirt? How did you evolve into the T-shirt?
Yeah, well, that's basically something that I'm working on right now. It's not T-shirts, and I'll talk about this a little bit more or I've got the time now. So. We started doing bikinis, actually. That's where the revenue is right now. I'm doing a high fashion swimwear line because you can basically get this stuff printed and then sell it, because it's high fashion. So I actually contacted the MSG cartel because I had read this story. It was on the cover of the Miami New Times magazine, and it was kind of a heartbreaking story. One of their guys, back in June on his 21st birthday, was killed, and he left an 8 to 12-month-old orphan. Like right or wrong, the kid's in the world. So it's just one of these things where the end of the story is his best friend and one of like his tagging partners and all this sort of stuff is going around and he's putting up stickers with his deceased friend's like tag on it. And the guy is arrested, and he's got this trunk full of T-shirts that he spent like $1,000 on, which is big money for these guys. And the cop confiscates the T-shirts. And he arrests him for like committing conspiracy and stuff, like just ridiculous charges, and holds him on $25 bail. The cops don't like graffiti artists, but so I was kind of like taken aback, and I was moved by the story because this guy like apparently was like in the back of a police car like crying and everything. I mean, he still wasn't over his friend's death at the point. He probably still isn't. But so I contacted I contacted him, reached out to him, and I was actually really nervous about doing that because I've taken his art and I've started to commercialize a little bit, which these guys are also anti-commercial in a lot of ways. But he loved the idea of doing like a not-for-profit line for Why Not's son. So and that was a good ending as well, because I think it's kind of, again, that community building and all this sort of stuff, and it's really been an eye-opening experience to just be in on like the urban art front as well.
But are you using the gigapixel software to stitch your?
No. I started there, and I liked AutoPano Pro's stuff as well, so I just switched over to that software.
When you said that was a big file, I'm having some trouble with my files now. They're really big. Open Photoshop.
Yeah. When I started doing the Gigapan stuff, I realized that was going to be an issue, so I actually like custom built a computer that was like enough to handle these things, and that was my first sort of attempt at being the fine artist in this, because I saw a lot of the Gigapans on the site, and they were beautiful and they were staggering and awe-inspiring and all that, but they weren't perfect. So for me to like produce a print out of this stuff, I felt like it needed to be perfect. So that's also why I built that computer, was because I knew that I wanted to like retouch these 2 to 3 gigapixel files, and I started doing that. And there's not manipulation in this anymore. I've gotten pretty good with like the technique of just taking the photographs and processing them. But initially, especially when I was doing HDR experiments, and there was, you know, fast-moving cop cars and a couple like different people moving through and stuff, I would actually go back in and use the zero exposure, and so I would manipulate it to get just you know, perfect subjects. I've actually heard that AutoPano is really good at removing the HDR stuff now too. So. But.
Well, let's thank the speaker. Thank you very much.